In 3200 BC, the Neolithic builders of Britain embarked on an extraordinary project that would change their world forever. As they set the first stones of the great monument at Stonehenge, they were not just creating a structure, but a legacy that would echo through the ages. Welcome to the Neolithic era, a time of innovation and transformation where early humans harnessed agriculture, herded cattle, and erected monumental structures with unmatched ingenuity. In this audiobook, we'll explore the remarkable story of these ancient pioneers, their bold ventures across uncharted lands, and the monumental achievements that continue to captivate our imagination. Step back in time with us and uncover the secrets of a civilization that laid the very foundations of human progress. Chapter 1. The Sea, the Land, and the Unknown Horizon. Imagine yourself thousands of years ago, standing at the edge of a rugged coastline. The waves crash relentlessly against the rocks, sending sprays of salt water high into the air. But this is not the start of a small fishing journey or a casual adventure. No, this is something far more ambitious. A crossing. Not just across a river or a stream, but across miles and miles of open, treacherous seas. It's a journey across waters so turbulent that no amount of paddling could overcome the swift currents. A journey where even a slight misjudgment in navigation would lead to ruin. This, however, is what the Neolithic farmers of Britain and Ireland undertook. They were not just tied to the land as we often imagine, toiling in fields, building massive stone monuments, but rather they were an intrepid, seafaring people. Yes, these ancient people possessed a knowledge of the tides and currents that was nothing short of profound. They may not have been deep-sea fishers or hunters of marine mammals, but make no mistake, they were maritime experts. To survive, they depended on their livestock, primarily their beloved cattle, and so they devised ways to ferry these large animals across treacherous seas. Picture it, a group of men and women, bound for distant shores, paddling across a sea filled with swift currents, a cow perhaps bound and secured in their primitive boat. One mistake, and they would be swallowed by the water. Yet, this was their reality. Chapter 2. The Necessity of Cows. Why did these ancient people risk such dangerous journeys across treacherous waters? The answer lies in the very fabric of their existence. Cows were not just animals. They were the backbone of Neolithic society. Dairy was crucial for their survival, and cows provided more than just meat. Milk, cheese, and butter formed the foundation of their diet. These weren't mere luxuries, they were necessities. Without cows, these early farmers could not sustain their communities. Their ability to nourish their families, farm the land, and survive long winters all depended on these animals. Over time, their settlements grew, and so did their herds. Yet, life in Neolithic Britain was fragile, constantly threatened by growing populations and limited resources. But the risks they took, transporting cattle across islands and difficult terrains, were acts of survival and determination. These people faced daily struggles but adapted through their intimate connection to their environment and livestock. As the centuries passed, their knowledge deepened. Farmers in Neolithic Europe, unable to digest raw milk due to lactose intolerance, found ingenious ways to make dairy digestible by turning it into cheese and yogurt. Archaeologists have found evidence of these dairy practices on ancient pottery, revealing that cheesemaking was common as far back as 6000 BC. Vessels uncovered in Poland and Hungary bear traces of dairy fats, proving how central dairy was to Neolithic diets. Further research shows that Neolithic farmers incorporated wild aurochs into their herds, enhancing the strength and productivity of their cattle. This careful breeding reflected a deep understanding of animal husbandry. The people's lives, diets, and very survival were inextricably linked to these animals. Each journey, each risk undertaken to protect their herds, was a testament to their resilience and determination to endure. In this way, we can feel a connection to these ancient farmers, understanding that their lives revolved around the survival of their cattle, just as ours depend on modern innovations. Their choices, driven by necessity, have left an indelible mark on human history.
Chapter 3: The Rise and Fall of Farming. The story of Neolithic Britain and Ireland is about creativity, hardship, and change. Around 4000 BC, early settlers started a way of life that would shape their societies for many years. Unlike their ancestors in Europe, who grew a wide range of crops, the farmers in Neolithic Britain focused on only a few. Emmer wheat and barley were their main crops, while they did not grow beans or other legumes. At first, these crops helped the population grow. Neolithic people cut down large areas of forest with their stone axes to make space for farming. They knew how to raise animals, and their cattle were important not just for meat and milk, but also for fertilizing the land. For a while, their farming worked well. Growing crops and raising animals allowed them to live in bigger groups and form early societies. But as the population grew, problems started to appear. Farming in Neolithic Britain was hard because they had few types of crops, and the soil was tough to work with. The northern climate and rocky, poor soil made farming difficult. Though they used manure to improve their fields at first, their methods couldn't keep up with the increasing demand for food. As time went on, the soil became worn out. Constant farming without giving the land time to recover caused the crops to produce less. Unlike farmers in southern Europe, who grew a wider variety of crops and improved their farming techniques, the Neolithic farmers in Britain stuck to wheat and barley. This lack of variety in crops and farming methods hurt them. As the soil lost its fertility, their harvests became smaller, and the risk of famine grew. By 3600 BC, the situation became clear. Fields that once fed many people began to struggle. The forests that had been cleared for farming started to grow back in the north. As settlements weakened, barley, the toughest crop, was one of the last to survive. But even barley couldn't sustain their society forever. One by one, farming communities began to fall apart, and people left the land in search of better opportunities. The collapse of farming didn't happen overnight. It was a slow process. Fields that once supported villages were left unused, and nature took over again. Without enough food, Neolithic communities shrank. Some may have tried new farming methods or different crops, but their harsh environment limited what they could do. Over time, many villages were abandoned, and people either moved away or became hunters, gatherers, or traders. Still, their efforts weren't in vain. The farmers of Neolithic Britain set the stage for future generations. Their ways of farming were simple by today's standards, but they made a bold attempt to change the land and use nature's resources. They cleared forests, built stone structures that still stand, and grew the first crops on British soil. Even though their farming ways faded, they left behind the foundation for future developments. The rise and fall of farming in Neolithic Britain reminds us of the delicate relationship between people and nature. It's a story of success, failure, and change, with the land playing a major role, both giving life and taking it back. Their challenges echo through time, connecting us to the earliest days of farming when survival depended on the changing seasons and the harvests. Chapter 4: A Shift Toward Cattle Herders. The Neolithic people of Britain, faced with worsening land conditions and fewer crops, reached a turning point. With their once productive farms failing and the soil no longer giving them enough food, they did what humans always do in hard times: they adapted. As problems grew, a big change happened. What had once been a mix of farming and herding became focused on cattle. Cattle, once valued for milk, meat, and manure, now became the main part of their economy. They were more than just animals. They became vital to their survival. The environmental changes were serious. The cooling climate started to warm, changing the land. Forests grew back in areas where crops used to grow, and crops like wheat and barley struggled to survive. But the land that couldn't support crops became ideal for grazing cattle. The smart Neolithic communities saw this chance and turned to cattle herding, which better matched the changing weather and landscape. This wasn't a small change. It completely transformed their way of life. Where fields of wheat and barley once stretched across the land, large open pastures for cattle replaced them. The landscape changed as forests were cleared, not for crops but for grazing. The needs of their cattle now set the pace of life, and their society shifted to a more mobile lifestyle. Instead of staying in one place to farm, they moved with their livestock, following the seasons to keep their herds healthy. It must have been a big realization for their society, much like it is for us today, to see how late Neolithic Britons fully embraced cattle herding. What had once been just a part of their way of life now became its main focus. This wasn't just about survival, it was a major shift in how they saw and used the land. Instead of fighting to grow crops on difficult soil, they took advantage of the natural abundance of grassland, letting their cattle thrive where crops had failed. This change didn't just affect how they got food. It also changed their social structure. Farming had required settled communities to stay in one place and care for fields, but cattle herding led to a more flexible moving lifestyle. Villages probably became more temporary, with families moving to follow their herds to better grazing land. The hard work of farming, plowing, planting, and harvesting, was replaced by herding, milking, and managing livestock. This new way of life required new skills, and the Neolithic people became experts in raising cattle. But this wasn't a step backward into a simpler life. On the contrary, choosing to focus on cattle herding was a smart and thoughtful response to their environment's challenges. It allowed them to keep thriving in a world where farming no longer worked. Cattle provided food, but also useful materials like leather and bone for tools. Over time, cattle became symbols of wealth and status, and owning cattle likely played a role in the community's social structure. This move to herding also changed how they interacted with nearby communities. Cattle herding made trade and connections easier. As they moved their herds, herders likely created new routes and relationships with others. This increased movement allowed them to trade goods and ideas, further enriching their culture. Cattle became valuable in trade, serving as more than just food. They were central to their growing social and economic life. For centuries, the people of late Neolithic Britain and Ireland thrived as cattle herders. Focusing on herding may have seemed like a big shift away from the farming traditions of their ancestors, but it allowed them to survive in a changing world. Their fields became pastures, their farming tools were replaced by herding tools, and their lives revolved around their cattle. It was a way of life that worked better than farming, allowing their communities to grow again, even in a changed landscape. While this change from farming might seem like a step back, it was actually a smart and forward-thinking move. It was based on resilience, creativity, and a strong understanding of their surroundings. In the end, they survived not by clinging to old ways but by embracing change, recognizing when it was time to let the land guide their future. Chapter 5: The Monuments of Power and Memory. As the Neolithic people of Britain changed from farming to herding cattle, they also began building big stone structures. These structures were not only amazing because of how they were built, but they also showed how organized and complex their society had become. These monuments were more than just buildings. They were signs of power and memory. One of the most famous types of these monuments were the long barrows. These were long tombs made from stone and earth. People were buried in them, but they were also used to show who owned the land and who had power. The West Kennet Long Barrow is one of the largest of these tombs. It was over 100 meters long and 20 meters wide. Imagine how many people and how much work it took to build something so big. These long barrows, with their stone chambers and fancy entrances, were built to last a long time, not just in a physical sense, but also as a way to show power and memory for years to come. But the long barrows weren't the only important things they built. In many places in southern Britain, the Neolithic people built causewayed enclosures. These were large, round spaces surrounded by ditches and raised banks of earth. The exact reason why these sites were built is still debated, but it is likely that they had more than one use. They might have been places where people traded, held feasts, or came together for rituals. Whatever their purpose, they were clearly important, and they were found all across Britain. The long barrows were not just places to bury the dead. They were signs of ownership and control over the land. They were built in places where many people could see them, showing that the people who built them were powerful. Building a long barrow was not something one person could do alone. It took a whole community working together. By building these tombs, the people tied themselves to the land and to their ancestors. These monuments were a way for the community to show that they were connected to the land and to each other. Building these structures took a lot of effort and planning. The people of this time didn't have modern tools, but they still managed to move large amounts of stone and earth. This showed that they were skilled at working together and organizing big projects. These monuments also showed that the people who built them were thinking about the future. They were built to last, so that future generations could remember the people who built them. The long barrows and causewayed enclosures were more than just practical places. They were symbols of the social, political, and spiritual lives of the Neolithic people. They showed the values, beliefs, and ambitions of the people who built them. Even as the society around them changed, moving from farming to herding cattle, these monuments stayed the same. They were lasting signs of the people's connection to the land and to each other. These stone structures are more than just examples of good building skills. They show us something about the people's inner lives, their beliefs, their connection to the land, and their desire to be remembered. These monuments are a reminder that the people of Neolithic Britain were not just trying to survive. They were creating something that would last, something that would be remembered long after they were gone. Chapter 6: A Changing World. But even these monuments, impressive as they were, could not halt the changes that were sweeping across the land. By 3500 BC, new causewayed enclosures stopped being built. The population was declining, and the once bustling settlements were starting to empty. Signs of conflict began to appear in the archaeological record. Fortifications were built, palisades were erected, and defensive earthworks appeared around the enclosures. By 3000 BC, many of these Neolithic societies had entered a period of reorganization. Farming was no longer the focus of life. Cattle pastoralism, coupled with the use of wild plant resources, became the dominant way of living. As the population shrank, society changed in response. Social hierarchies may have been less pronounced, and ritual practices became more localized, more personal. Yet, in this time of relative decline, new forms of power began to emerge. The great passage graves of Ireland, such as Newgrange and Knowth, were built during this period, their chambers aligned with the winter solstice, a testament to the astronomical knowledge and spiritual focus of these people. In the north, on the cold, wind-swept Orkney Islands, massive ceremonial sites such as the Ness of Brodger rose to prominence. Chapter 7: The final chapter of the Neolithic. By around 2500 BC, the Neolithic period in Britain and Ireland was slowly coming to an end. The people who had been farming, herding cattle, and building huge stone monuments were now facing big changes. New people, called the Bell Beaker people, arrived from Europe. They brought new things with them: copper, gold, and fresh ways of living. These new arrivals were not only expert metalworkers, but they were also skilled warriors. They quickly became a big part of life in Britain and Ireland, slowly replacing many of the native people who had lived there for thousands of years. But even though the Neolithic people were no longer the main group in Britain and Ireland, their story didn't end completely. Their impact on the land, the way they lived, and the monuments they built all remained. The Neolithic people had changed the land forever, and their influence continued to be felt even after they were gone. The way they perfected cattle herding and the way they organized their lives around the land didn't disappear. It became part of the lasting traditions of the people who followed them. When you visit the fields and forests of Britain and Ireland today, you can still feel a connection to these ancient people. Their long barrows, built to honor their dead, still rise against the skyline, standing as quiet reminders of a world that existed long before ours. These great tombs, which took so much effort to build, show us the deep connection they had with the land and their ancestors. And the stone circles, which have puzzled and amazed people for centuries, still stand in their places. These stone circles tell the story of a people who knew how to work together, who were creative, and who had a strong belief in the power of the land and the skies above. But the story of the Neolithic people is not just written in stone, it is also written in the way they lived. They were brave pioneers, crossing dangerous seas with their cattle, searching for new lands to farm and settle. Imagine for a moment what it must have been like for them, setting off across the sea in simple boats, hoping to find new places to call home. These early settlers were driven by more than just the need to survive. They had a desire to explore, to create, and to build a life that was different from anything that had come before. Their courage and ambition helped shape the world we know today. Even though new people came and new ways of living were introduced, the legacy of the Neolithic people remains strong. Their hard work, their creativity, and their connection to the land are still a part of the landscape, and their influence can still be felt in the traditions and stories that continue today. Their monuments are not just ancient ruins. They are powerful reminders of a time when people worked together to build a world that was new and full of possibilities.